This is a process that could alter entire food webs in aquatic ecosystems, which is triggered by excess nutrients, oftentimes nitrogen or phosphorus based. Uh, Eventually, this leads to an increase in biochemical oxygen demand, leading to anoxic environments, and really severe cases can lead to dead zones as well. So, before we go into the full process, just a review of biochemical oxygen demand and dissolved oxygen. So there's lots of critters in the water that use oxygen, obviously, and then there's lots of, you know, smaller microorganisms in the water too that are limited by the amount of nutrients, by the amount of food they have to digest. Sometimes there could be an influx of extra nutrients. In this case, we have some discharge of sewage, and that sewage is causing all those organisms to decompose that material. And as they're decomposing, they're doing some respiration like we are. And so that's what causes the demand for oxygen to increase, right? As our compost is being processed, it's actually using oxygen, producing carbon dioxide and other gases too. So you see this drop as all those organisms digest the organic matter. And then as the organic matter is depleted, the demand decreases. As that demand decreases, the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water will once again return. So the really simple process here in eutrophication, you get some fertilizer, which makes your crops grow. Some of that fertilizer runs off into the water because of rain. And then as it runs off, a bunch of algae grows, right? It has extra nutrients. It's like, oh, this is awesome. And then it uses all the nutrients. And so the algae dies. And once the algae dies, you have the whole cycle we just saw with the oxygen sag curve. So let's go through, look at some impacts. Could lead to low levels of dissolved oxygen, loss of biodiversity, and sometimes like entire food chains impacted. You'll lose flowering plants as the sunlight is blocked out, or reeds. And then there'll be death of aerobic organisms, ones that need oxygen. And then the cloudiness, the turbidity, will increase too. This excess nutrients oftentimes comes from fertilizers. Of course, most fertilizers are N, P, and K based. Factory farms, another big one. So here you can see a so-called factory farm with the cesspool of sewage and waste. During a flood, these might overtop, go into the river. Human wastewater plants, too, a lot of them are right next to rivers. A lot of them do spill into rivers during flooding events. There was one in Oak Creek just a couple of years ago where they were doing some construction work and busted a sewage pipe. Lots of different things. All drains lead to the ocean, as the signs say. Okay, so here's the process of eutrophication, step by step. So first we're going to have some nutrients running off into rivers and lakes. And you can see here our nutrients represented in white here. Perhaps more concentrated in the pond because it's closer. But also if you think about the river, there's always new fresh water coming in. So generally rivers will be more diluted than a standing body of water. Though of course it's all relative. So that extra phosphate or nitrogen promotes algal growth. That's a limiting factor for algae, so then they can go crazy. And these algal blooms or mats can sometimes just cover the entire surface of the water. Not nice to look at either. This leads to increased turbidity, and so it blocks sunlight for all those plants down there. Less photosynthesis. That's not good for them. And then this could lead to, compounding impacts. Sometimes counteracting impacts too. More algae could lead to more zooplankton. More zooplankton is more food prey for fish, but then more fish would eat the zooplankton. So we have fewer zooplankton, and then there's fewer zooplankton to eat the algae. So lots of just sort of compounding effects, as these complex webs are responding to changes. Eventually, though, the algae will use all of the nutrients, so that limiting factor returns, and then all the algae dies. So we have solved the problem, except this algae now becomes a sort of compost material for all the microorganisms in the water. So those microorganisms are like, "Go, great, now it's our turn," and we get an increase in biochemical oxygen demand as they start to break down that material. And then as they're respiring, they're using up the oxygen, our level of dissolved oxygen decreases, stressing all those marine organisms. Sometimes this could lead to like entire food chain collapses or dead zones. Yeah, pretty grim stuff. So these happen at varying scales too. I mean, you can see sort of localized dead zones. We've seen algal blooms on the Verde River. You can see how a watershed drains all of the water in that surrounding area. Any rain that falls there will eventually go into the same body of water. And here you can see a huge scale. So you have a few different sources of nutrients here. The green being different farms, and then the red areas are cities. Chicago, Milwaukee up here. This one must be Denver. You got St. Louis. So all of these draining eventually into the Mississippi River. And maybe you've heard about dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. Though they've also had a lot of problems with temperature lately, which is kind of horrifying. There is some natural eutrophication that happens, but this usually happens over a much longer scale versus human-caused eutrophication, which happens really quickly, doesn't allow as many organisms to adapt or adjust. But we can do a few different things to manage eutrophication. We have the three levels of pollution management. We could alter human behavior. We could regulate the pollutants at the point of emission, or we could clean up and restore. Maybe you could guess which of the three we see right here. Yeah, they're obviously cleaning up, the restoration right here. Maybe see if you can think of examples of the other two before going to the next slide right now. Here's some things you could do. Obviously banning detergents or banning those fertilizers. You could time the fertilizer application better. A lot of times putting down your fertilizers in a really rainy season will just lead to them running off into the water, and then that's all your money leaving too. Buffer zones are a great way to help too. Basically, you add some plants, and those plants will help absorb excess nutrients. I really don't like seeing green lawns right up to the edge of the river. It's nice to have reeds and stuff like that in between. We could treat our wastewater before releasing it, and we could more effectively divert our sewage. And then we could also minimize our fertilizer dosage or use organic matter. This is actually from the IB textbook, but to me this last point sort of kind of fits more into altering human activity, right? Like doing less of a fertilizer dosage. I mean, I guess that's sort of at the point of emission, but I don't know. Splitting hairs, right? This one's definitely different. To deal with low oxygen, we could add more air to the lakes, pump some air in. We could do some dredging. That's what you were seeing here, right? Scooping up the bottom stuff from the bottom of lakes, physically removing weeds, and then restocking them with the appropriate organisms. Okay, hope you enjoyed.